Are the recent Palestine protests a threat to your First Amendment rights? Or are they a powerful exercise of them? Can a pro-life activist be arrested for simply just standing up for the unborn? And what about the January 6th protest? Was it a true expression of American rights or a dangerous violation? In this episode, we'll challenge the boundaries of freedom, protest, and what it means to really fight for your beliefs in today's world. Hey y'all, and welcome back to Voices of Liberty. I'm your host, Isabel, and I'm so thankful y'all are joining me for episode 4. We have so much to unpack in this episode, so I can't wait to dive in. But before we do, I do want to give some podcast shout-outs because y'all are sharing this podcast like crazy, and it really just makes me so happy to see, and it's just such a blessing, and I'm so grateful for y'all. Thank you so much. So I want to give a shout-out to Shalia Mock, Yvette Smith, Autumn, and Brianna Roman. Y'all have been sharing this podcast, and it just makes me so happy to see. I'm so thankful and so grateful, and what an amazing blessing to have that. So y'all keep sharing. If you share with just one friend and you send me proof at voicesoflibertycontact@gmail.com, I will give you a shout out on the podcast. I'm going to be sending y'all stickers this week, and I'm just so excited. So you get an exclusive CCW sticker if you shout out the podcast and send it to one friend. And I do want to preface and say that this is while supplies last because y'all have been sharing like crazy. So I'm going to be sending the ones that I shouted out in today's episode and last week's episode a sticker pretty soon. And I just am so grateful. Again, I don't even have words. I'm so happy. But y'all, please continue to share with your friends who love politics and Jesus, just all the things. It would really mean a lot to me. Before we dive into this episode, we have a new verse of the week and weekly challenge. And the verse of the week this week is, "The words of the reckless pierce like swords, but the tongue of the wise bring healing." Proverbs 12:18. Y'all, this verse is so convicting because if you know me, you know that I love politics. I love to talk about all of these things. But there are times when I respond too soon and I say things I don't mean, or I could end up potentially hurting someone with my words. And so I've really just had to try to just step back a little bit. I've learned that it's okay if you don't have all the answers. It's okay if you need to pause and do some research and come back to it. And it's okay to just be silent. There's nothing wrong with not responding to someone, especially on social media. You know, our words can really hurt others. And so this verse has really just stuck out to me because the words of the reckless pierce like swords. Our words can literally pierce people like swords. If we're not careful, they can hurt. But the tongue of the wise will bring healing. I want my words as a Christian. I want my words to bring healing. I want my words to reflect Christ. And so the past few months, I really just tried to hone in on this. Especially with social media, I have really tried to just be quiet or respond in kindness versus just immediately getting fired up about something. And sometimes I'll just take a step back and not respond because not everything needs a response. That's just the truth. Like, not everything needs a response. And so sometimes we just have to kind of take a step back and just let the Lord work in the person's heart. I know that for me, that's something I've really just been trying to focus on. And so the weekly challenge this week is to just speak life to others. Be like Christ. Reflect Christ with your words. Be kind to people. That doesn't mean you're a doormat. That does not mean at all you have to be a doormat for people to just to walk all over you. But there are times when you can be a little bit more stern about things. But I do think that, especially in the Facebook group recently, and just on social media all over, I've seen a lot of people attacking other people. Especially if you're a Christian, we need to be better than that, y'all. We need to be better. We need to be speaking life and reflecting Christ with our words. And it's so important that we do that. And so that's a weekly challenge this week, especially with your own marriage and your friends and your family. Just try to let your words reflect Christ. I know it can be hard, and it's something you have to really just train yourself to do and retrain your brain to think, because our flesh automatically wants to react when someone says something rude to us or mean. We obviously want to react in a way that's not Christ-like, and so we have to really fight the flesh on that. So with all I said, I highly suggest you sign up for our email list because these weekly challenges and weekly verses tie into our email list. So I really encourage you to sign up. We send out email lists twice a week on Tuesdays and Wednesdays, and it's just such a great reminder. And then we also send some blog posts and things like that we've been working on throughout the week. But today we're going to be talking about the right to peaceably assemble. And I want to reread the First Amendment again. I want y'all to try to memorize this if you can, because it will never hurt to have this in your memory. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or the press, or the right of the people to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. We talked about, in the first episode, the history of the Bill of Rights. The second episode, we talked about the establishment of religion. We talked about that the government cannot establish a specific religion for America, and we talked about how the free exercise part discusses the right of the people to freely exercise their religion how they please. Abridging the freedom of speech or of the press was what we covered last week, and we talked about how not all free speech is free. There are limits to our freedom of speech, especially when it talks about violence and things like that. So I highly suggest you go and refresh your memory on that if you need to. So today we're going to be talking about the right of the people to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So before we really just start unpacking all this, I want you to ask yourself, what does it even mean to peaceably assemble and to petition the government? What does that even mean? Really just think about it for a second. I'm going to start with the right to peaceably assemble. And just plain and simple, this means the right to protest or gather together in one general area, peaceably, of course. So why did the Founding Fathers find this important? I think it's important to understand that prior to the American Revolution, both the colonial government and the British parliamentary government increased taxes on important goods and increased control over local affairs in the colonies. So if you remember our last episode, we talked about how the British Parliament imposed the Stamp Act, which taxed the colonists very, very high on all paper goods. And this also prevented their freedom of speech because they weren't able to publish articles in the paper, especially those of a lower class. They weren't able to publish articles in a paper, whether they were sharing their distaste for the British Parliament or the British government or whatever the case is. They were not able to publish articles because they couldn't afford it. And so that was really stepping on their freedom of speech a little bit. So the British authorities felt that the colonies needed to be restrained as they were becoming unruly. And in addition to this, the British needed funding after the French and Indian War. So there was the French and Indian War. The king needed funding after that because obviously wars are expensive. So while this increase in tensions was occurring, the colonists began to question the legitimacy of the taxes that were imposed on them. What's important to understand is in Parliament, you had people to represent you, but the colonists did not. And can you imagine just having all these taxes imposed on you, but having no one to hear your case or hear your side with things or really just advocate for you? I mean, that would be really hard. That's just something I really want to draw attention to and for y'all to remember. So the British citizens had people representing them in Parliament. They at least had somewhat a voice in how they were taxed, but the colonists were not extended that same right. So the British Parliament was essentially just taking advantage of the colonists to fund the aftermath of the French Indian War. And so they imposed Tea Act after they found out that colonists were drinking about 1.2 million pounds of tea a year, which is a lot of tea. And knowing that, they imposed the Tea Act, and that just imposed very, very high taxes on the tea. John Hancock and Samuel Adams began a smuggling operation to get the tea into the colonies at a much cheaper price. While there is more that goes into that story alone, these events are what led to the Boston Tea Party, and which occurred on December 16, 1773. American patriots rallied together, dressed as Native Americans, and took over the ships that carried the goods. Once they took over the ships, they threw the tea overboard as a way to protest against the high taxes that Britain imposed on them. While this again may seem extreme, the colonists had to take drastic measures like this to ensure that their voices were heard by Parliament. They worked together to speak up, and while it was very dangerous due to their efforts to protest and fight the tyranny of the British government, America is now a nation. They knew that if they caused a bunch of protests, a bunch of ruckus, that they would essentially be heard by Parliament because the word would get around and the king would hear about it, and so they would essentially have their side heard. So when we peaceably assemble, it essentially is just getting together. This could be for a church service, gathering at an event, and of course, protesting. When citizens march for a cause, let's just say like pro-life, for example, this is an example of them exercising that right specifically. The March for Life just happened in Washington, D.C. in January, and people from all over America came to March for Life. And one of them was our very own Vice President, J.D. Vance, which I thought was really, really cool and respectable. We also have to remember that when we protest for something or march for something, it is no longer a right when it resorts to violence. We have to be able to draw the line of when it becomes violent and when it is just us exercising our right. Okay, we're going to take a little pause for a second so I can tell you about the Anastasia Co. The Anastasia Co. is a clothing, stationery, and gift brand on a mission to share truth and encouragement through thoughtfully designed products. In their shop, you'll find beautiful shirts, hats, journals, wall art, stickers, and so much more. To shop, visit shop.theanastasiaco.com. If you use the code CCWives10, it will get you 10% off your order. I own her Coffee Plus Kingdom Work hat and her planner, and I always get so many compliments in the hat. And I use the planner a lot when prepping for this podcast. It helps keep me organized and just stay on track. So again, if you go get yours today at shop.theanastasiaco.com, code CCWives10 to get 10% off your order. I just want to tell the story of a lady named Bevelyn Williams. She was a mother, a wife, and she had a passion for advocating for the unborn and even advocating for these mothers who were pregnant and walking into these clinics like Planned Parenthood. She has a ministry called At the Well Ministries, and she is a very, very godly woman. Bevelyn was doing a Facebook Live with one of her coworkers when she said that she wanted to terrorize Planned Parenthood. Bevelyn actually meant no threats in literal terms, but the threats were actually more spiritual. She had no intentions of harming anyone. So not long after this Facebook video happened, she was out protesting peaceably in front of Planned Parenthood. So I'm going to read her account according to liveaction.com of what happened. Williams explained that while she was standing on the sidewalk, a woman from the inside of the facility opened the door and whacked me in the back. Williams added, she never said, "Excuse me," or made me aware that she was even there. When I leaned back, she claimed I slammed her hand in the door. She didn't go to urgent care until 5 days later, and on the stand she said that it was the right hand that was slammed, but in the picture it was her left. I don't believe she's being honest, as she should. That was Bevelyn's account according to liveaction.com. I linked it in the show notes so you could read her entire story. But because a Planned Parenthood employee was accidentally harmed, and because Bevelyn had made what some saw as literal threats to Planned Parenthood weeks prior, she was convicted. So something I want y'all to understand is there is a law called the FACE Act, and because of the FACE Act, Williams was arrested and sentenced to 41 months in federal prison under the Biden administration. She was stripped from her husband and precious little daughter, and for those who aren't familiar, the FACE Act is essentially just a law that was passed that protects places like Planned Parenthood and the women going in. You cannot stop them from getting reproductive health care. So FACE stands for the Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances, FACE Act, passed in 1994, makes it a federal crime to use force, threats, or physical obstruction to interfere with someone seeking or providing reproductive health services, including abortion, or to damage facilities providing such services. While the Planned Parenthood employee lied and made false accusations, none of this seemed to be checked. And thankfully, Bevelyn did use her time in prison to glorify the Lord and witness to people and really just be a light in such a dark place. And we know what Satan means for evil, God means for good. I also want to say that because the FACE Act is put in place, that does not mean you cannot advocate for life or protest at these clinics. It just means that you can't threaten someone, you can't prevent people from walking in or interfere with that. The really, really sad part is Bevelyn is not the only one who was wrongfully convicted. There were 23 other people as well, and thankfully Trump released them all as soon as he came into office. And I want to play this little audio clip for you from the White House. It really, when I saw this, it really just brought me to tears because it is such a blessing to have a president who seems to care and who even understands that these women and men were wrongfully convicted for just exercising their right to protest freely. So I'm going to go ahead and play this audio clip for you that the White House posted in January, and they also played this at the March for Life. Take a listen.
Hello to everyone at the March for Life. It's a pleasure to speak to you from the beautiful Oval Office. That's where we are right now, the magnificent Oval Office. And thank you for turning out once again to show your extraordinary love and compassion for the unborn. Each year, Americans of every age, color, and background travel to our nation's capital by the tens of thousands to stand up for precious little babies who cannot stand up for themselves. I am proud to be the first president ever to have joined you in person. As you know, this annual march started 52 years ago on the first anniversary of the disastrous ruling known as Roe v. Wade. That unconstitutional decision took power away from the states and the voters, kicking off 50 years of division and anger. But thanks to your tireless work and devotion across 5 decades, that historic wrong was set right 3 years ago. I was so proud to be a participant. 6 courageous justices of the Supreme Court of the United States returned the issue to the state legislatures and to the people where it belongs. It became a vote of the people. In my second term, we will again stand proudly for families and for life. We will protect the historic gains we have made and stop the radical Democrat push for a federal right to unlimited abortion on demand up to the moment of birth and even after birth. Think of that, after birth. And some people want that. Can you believe it? We will work to offer a loving hand to new mothers and young families, and we will support adoption and foster care. We will protect women and vulnerable children. Under my leadership, a reformed Department of Justice will finally investigate the radical left attacks on churches and crisis pregnancy centers, and we will bring perpetrators to justice. We will get them to justice one way or the other. I will also end the weaponization of law enforcement against Americans of faith, and I'm releasing the Christians and pro-life activists who were persecuted by the Biden regime for praying and living out their faith. I just signed that document, and they're being released. One such American was Paula Harlow. At 75 years old, Paula was sentenced to 2 years in prison after praying outside of a clinic. That's why she was sentenced to 2 years. That's what happened under the Biden regime. In her sentencing, the judge mocked her Christian faith while her husband pleaded to be thrown in jail with his wife, fearing she would die alone behind bars. This week, it was my honor to grant a full and complete pardon to Paula and many others who were the victims of this horrific weaponization. Never again will religious persecution be allowed to happen in America. To all of the very special people marching today in this bitter cold, I know your hearts are warm and your spirits are strong, because your mission is just very, very pure, to forge a society that welcomes and protects every child as a beautiful gift from the hand of our Creator. Thank you for never losing hope and never giving up. Thank you for your tremendous support. God bless you, and God bless America.
You can say what you want about President Trump, but I do believe that he is probably one of the presidents who have probably done the most for the pro-life movement, especially after this. Releasing these pro-life activists was huge and was such a huge win for the pro-life community. Another example I want to give of us being able to peaceably protest is on January 6th. Lots of people rallied together on January 6th because they felt the election had been stolen and had been rigged. And before you argue with me on this, there were lots of questions when it came to the 2020 election. We did not have the election results until weeks after Election Day, which is almost unheard of. And there was a lot of things going on that really just made people question things like, why is this happening? I mean, we had reports of voting machines messing up. We had reports of fraud. We had reports then and claims that social media was actually heavily influencing the election in 2020. So it's like, what do you actually believe? This does not, however, give people a right to storm inside the Capitol and wreak havoc on everything. I personally believe they had a right to be there in protest, but I don't believe they had a right to go in the Capitol. I don't know. I was not there. I don't know what all was actually true and what wasn't, but I can tell you what I saw on TV. And I don't know if this was Antifa or what people want to call it, but I did see some violence And I do think that is a cause for concern when it is things like this. I don't think that should have happened. I think those people, the MAGA supporters, should have just remained peaceful. I never once heard Trump call for them to get violent. I never once heard for him to say anything. I actually heard him say remain peaceful. So there's a lot of propaganda that comes with January 6th. And while you can think what you want to, I believe that there were violations of the First Amendment, but there were also expressions of it. And when it comes to the 2020 election, there were questions of whether it was legitimate or not. And people were very, very angry and upset. And if you're not super conservative and you're listening to this, many people were very angry and upset because with every election, we've almost always had the results like the next day. But with the 2020 election, it took literal weeks to get election results. And there was also reports of fraud in Georgia, which is where I'm from. So there was a lot going on in that specifically. And there was just so many questions that people had. And they were really beginning to question if the government was being truthful or not. Whether you believe that social media influenced the 2020 election or not, people were very, very upset, especially conservatives, and they wanted to exercise their right to protest. I do, again, don't get me wrong on this. I do not think it was right for them to storm into the Capitol. But I do think they had a right to hold their signs and express their disagreement with what happened. But I don't think they had a right to enter into the Capitol. We cannot forget the Hunter Biden laptop situation. What's interesting is we heard about this and then it just disappeared. So we heard about this news article and then the story just essentially disappeared. Sources say that if people had truly known what was on the laptop, the 2020 election may have turned out completely different. This article is from congress.gov. And it says, a significant majority, 78%, believe that access to the correct information could have been critical to their decision at the polls. In fact, 47% said that knowing before the election that the laptop contents were real and not disinformation would have changed their voting decision, including more than 2/3, which is 71% of Democrats. Almost 8 out of 10 respondents said a truthful interpretation of the laptop would have likely changed the election's outcome more in favor of Trump. The poll also found that more than half, 51%, give the media failing grades D or F for their coverage of the topic of the laptop. Like I said, we essentially didn't hear of it anymore. So this is why conservatives were upset on January 6th. And again, I don't think they should have stormed into the Capitol. But I do think conservatives have every right to protest that because they were very, very upset. And like I said, we have elections all the time and people just accept whatever happens. But with 2020, there was a lot of things going on that just seemed very, very sketchy. Everybody was questioning everything. And then we didn't get the election results until weeks after Election Day. And people were really, really furious. So I don't think they should have stormed into the Capitol, but I do think they had every right to protest. It should have remained peaceful, though. If January 6th was violent in any form, then it was also a violation of the First Amendment, because the First Amendment tells us to peaceably assemble. The point is, Americans have the freedom to protest and assemble as long as it is done peacefully. So moving on from that, I am sure many of you heard of the BLM, Black Lives Matter. And these riots took place, involved many protesters destroying public property and stealing, and they did this out of retaliation of George Floyd's death. I'm sure most of the BLM protests remained peaceful for the most part when it came to George Floyd's death and protesting that. But there were some that did get out of hand and they became riots. They began to destroy property around them, people's cars, people's homes, people's businesses, and they really just began to go off the chain. This became very violent. So I want to read this story from Axios.com, and the article reads, the vandalism and looting following the death of George Floyd at the hands of the Minneapolis police will cost the insurance industry more than any other violent demonstrations in recent history. Why does this matter? The protests that took place in 140 U.S. cities this spring were mostly peaceful, but the arson, vandalism, and looting that did occur will result in at least $1 billion to $2 billion of paid insurance claims. eclipsing the record set in Los Angeles in 1992 after the acquittal of the police officers who brutalized Rodney King. How it works. A company called Property Claim Services has tracked insurance claims related to civil disorders since 1950. It classifies anything over $20 million in insured losses as a catastrophe and reports that the unrest this year from May 26th to June 8th will cost the insurance industry far more than any prior one. That is crazy. And so I think when it gets to this point, you lose your right to peaceably protest. You're not actually peaceably protesting. You're causing harm to others and to America. And so I think at that point, it needs to be stopped. And you're no longer really advocating for your cause. You're more so taking advantage of other Americans when you're stealing and things like that. And that goes for even January 6th. Like, I don't think that's right. You shouldn't be taking anything that's not yours. You should not be vandalizing anything. You should be, if you're going to peaceably protest, you need to peaceably protest. So I'm sure y'all remember the civil rights movement that happened in 1963. People really began to notice the injustice that was being done on people of color, and they wanted change and equal rights. Because of this, over 260,000 people marched in Washington to protest, and they wanted equality. Following this was Dr. King's well-known speech, "I Have a Dream." Okay, y'all, let me tell you about my friends at Conviction Co. Conviction Co. is a family-owned business started by a Midwest stay-at-home mom. Their goal is to provide their customers with high-quality and on-trend apparel and accessories that make it easy to boldly share truth and spark important conversations. I own 2 of their hats, and they are the best quality hats. I own the trucker hats. One says "One Nation Under God," and the other one says "Make America Healthy Again." I had my husband trying them on, my dad trying them on, my cousin trying them on, and my grandma actually bought some of the hats. So that just shows how they really speak to people. They catch people's attention, and it's a way for you to boldly share your faith, but make it fashionable. So go to convictioncode.com and use the code officialccw to get 10% off your order. Again, that's convictioncode.com. Use code officialccw to get 10% off your order today. After this protest, it did not take long for government officials to notice and put policies in place for people of color to have the same rights as white people. So going to the Palestine protests, this is something that's actually happening right now. I'm sure you have seen all the footage of the pro-Palestine protest. While we may not like what they are protesting for, they legally have a right to protest and advocate for their cause. The situation does get tricky, though, when you have people who are not citizens protesting for the terrorist organization Hamas and threatening others. They should not be threatening other people in any way. They should not be threatening the Jewish people, and it can be very anti-Semitic when that happens. If you want to protest for Palestine, that's great, whatever. But the issue does come in when you are chanting things at these protests like, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." If you don't know what this means, this is essentially calling for the total destruction of Israel and the Jews, whether you realize it or not. I actually wonder if people who are at these pro-Palestine protests actually understand the depth and the weight of what they're saying. You're literally calling for the destruction of all Jewish people and the whole entire country of Israel. And I think that's wrong. These protesters have sometimes blocked the streets, encamped on college campuses, and destroyed property. I do believe people have the right to free speech and protest, even if I don't agree with their agenda specifically, but we do have to draw a line when it comes to violence and even destruction of public property. We talked about this with the January 6th protest. We talked about this with the George Floyd protest for Black Lives Matter. So we do have to draw a line somewhere. While some claim the protests for Palestine and protests for Hamas are different, sometimes these Palestine protests have posters that are for Hamas. So if you don't know, some of these posters people are holding at these pro-Palestine protests have an image of a paraglider, and this is essentially glorifying the terrorists on the October 7th attack in Israel with the paragliders. So in my opinion, if you are holding up these signs that have these images that are glorifying a terrorist organization, I do think that is wrong. I think that is wrong and it's not okay. I talked about Mahmoud Khalil in my last episode, and he is very popular right now. If you didn't listen to the last episode, I'll just kind of give you a brief summary. He was a student at Columbia University. He is an immigrant here. He is not, he's not born in America. He was born in Syria. He had a student visa to come and study at Columbia University. But now he has a green card. So something we have to understand is that having a green card does not make you a citizen of the United States. There is a difference. There are limitations on what you can and can't do and your rights. So something we have to understand is that he is in America legally, but he is not a citizen of the United States. Some rights that citizens have do extend to those who are not citizens, and that's something that we need to understand, is that there are some rights that do extend to non-citizens. However, the First Amendment right to free speech also applies to him. This case is probably going to go to the Supreme Court, and it will determine what rights people have who are not citizens but have a legal status. He is married to an American woman, and she has a child on the way. So he headed up the protests on Columbia's University last year when it came to Palestine. The Trump administration had him detained by ICE for supporting a terrorist organization. Protesting for Palestine and Hamas are two totally different things, and it needs to be made clear to us Americans what he was actually truly advocating for. If he was truly advocating for Hamas and the terrorist organization, then I would say he probably does need to go. Just because you have a visa, just because you have a green card, does not mean you have a right to advocate for terrorist organizations. And that is wrong, in my opinion. However, I do think that there needs to be some evidence given to us Americans as to what he was truly advocating for. I've heard that he had posters that were in support of Hamas, but I haven't seen them. There are laws that can get his green card revoked and get him deported if they find he poses a threat to national security. He can also be deported if he has committed a crime, which he has not done, so he would probably fall under the category of a threat to national security. So here's an article from ABC News, and I'm going to read it real quick. The detaining of Mahmoud Khalil, the Columbia University student and Palestine activist who possessed a green card, has raised questions about deportation risk faced by lawful permanent residents amid the Trump administration's escalating crackdown on immigration. President Donald Trump's administration, which has alleged that Khalil was a supporter of Hamas, has said that it has the authority to deport Khalil under the Immigration and Nationality Act. Secretary Marco Rubio reserves the right to revoke the visa of Mohammed Khalil under the Immigration and Nationality Act. The Secretary of State has the right to revoke a green card or visa for individuals who are adversarial to the foreign policy and national security interests of the United States of America. The White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said during a press conference this week. As I said earlier, I talked about this briefly in the last episode, but essentially Columbia University asked the students to tone it down. They were very, very adamant about the university cutting ties with Israeli companies. And then, in turn, Jewish students began to fear for their safety on campus. And so it was getting to be very, very escalated. And so the university was just like, hey, can y'all please tone it down to these Palestine activists? And this was Khalil's response. Remember, this is last year. And this was a PBS article. I linked it in my last episode. And I can link it in this one in the show notes too. But he basically said, we will not stop protesting and it won't just be encampments. The limit is the sky. So in my opinion, this does seem to be a threat. If Columbia University does not cut ties with Israeli companies, I feel like that is considered a threat. And so now he has been arrested and he faces deportation, but it has to go to court and all these things. So that's just something to think about. I want y'all to think about this and see for yourself if you truly believe he should be deported. This is an ongoing case, so we don't have all the facts, we don't have all the information, and that's something we have to understand. And something we have to remember is the Trump administration is not really giving us much evidence to go on to show that he is in fact guilty of supporting Hamas. So if he was just out there protesting for Palestine, I don't really see how he can be arrested because he is exercising his right to peaceably protest. But now if he was advocating for the terrorist organization Hamas, if that is the case, that's a different story and it needs to be addressed and he needs to go. ICE has also arrested a female Columbia University student involved in the protest. And while the media is using this to say Trump is preventing free speech, yada, 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 she did in fact overstay on her student visa, which is a crime. You cannot overstay on your student visa and expect to not get sent back to where you came from. Being in America is a privilege, and I don't think people really understand that. This article from BBC says, the DHS statement says that Miss Cordia had overstayed her visa, which had been terminated in 2022 for lack of attendance. It did not say whether she had been attending Columbia or another institution. She had previously been arrested in April of 2024 for taking part in protests at Columbia University, according to the Department of Homeland Security. Miss Srinivasan, a doctoral student in urban planning at Columbia University, had her visa revoked on March 5th. It is a privilege to be granted a visa to live and study in the United States of America, said Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem in a statement. And she's right. It is a privilege to have a visa to be able to study in America. Those are probably some cases that you'll hear about in the news that may have a lot of propaganda with it. But it is important to note that if they are overstaying on their visa and they're not applying for a new visa or applying to get citizenship here or applying to get a green card, whatever the case is, to make sure they are here in the States legally, then they are committing a crime and it is wrong. Americans have every right to protest as long as it remains peaceful, no matter if you support the cause or not. When a protest turns into something violent, that is where we have issues. When protests involve destroying property of other places, blocking streets, and encamping out on public property after being asked to leave, then it becomes a huge problem. I think the pro-Palestine protests are not in violation of the First Amendment until it gets violent or they refuse to obey the police. I was watching this protest actually unfold on the news the other day, and it seemed somewhat peaceful. They were just marching, but you could tell that they were blocking some of the streets, which you cannot do. And they began just brawling in the middle of the protest. People were just fighting for no reason. And, well, I'm sure they had a reason, but they were punching and all kinds of stuff. And I was like, what is happening right now? Like, aren't they supposed to be peaceably protesting? But they weren't. They were fighting, and the police had to get involved. And I think at that point, it becomes an issue. I want to bring a case to your attention from 1966, and this is the Adderley v. Florida case. It says Harriet Louise Adderley and a group of approximately 200 others assembled into a non-public jail driveway to protest the arrest of fellow students and the state and local policies of racial segregation, which included segregation in jails. Adderley and 31 others were convicted in a Florida court on a charge of trespass with malicious and mischievous intent for their refusal to leave the driveway when requested to do so. So Adderley and 31 others were asked to leave the driveway, and they said no and continued to protest. So the question is, were the petitioners denied their rights of free speech, assembly, and petition due to process of law and equal protection under the laws as guaranteed by the First and 14th Amendments? So were they in violation of the First Amendment? After they were asked to leave and they didn't leave and they continued to protest, was that a violation of the First Amendment? And was it a violation for the police to ask them to leave? The court found that there was no constitutional violations in this case. The language of the Florida statute was clearly defined and applied and argued by Justice Black, which prevented it from imposing broad infringements on speech and expression of rights. Furthermore, since the sheriff acted to maintain access to the jailhouse and not because he objected what was being sung or disagreed with the objectives of the protest, there were no First Amendment violations. Black concluded that the state does have the power to control its own property for lawful and non-discriminatory purposes. Essentially, the state does have control when it comes to things like this. And essentially, the ruling was 5-4 for the Supreme Court case, and they upheld the trespass convictions of the protesters, ruling that the state could enforce its trespass laws on jail property as it was not a public forum. If you would like to be involved in a protest that fits your values, I highly encourage you to really just research the cause before you do and make sure that you do it peaceably. Okay, y'all, let me tell you about my friends at 7 Weeks Coffee. 7 Weeks Coffee is America's pro-life coffee company on a mission to fund the pro-life movement one cup of coffee at a time. Why are they called 7 Weeks Coffee? Because at 7 weeks, a baby is the size of a little coffee bean, and it's the same time a heartbeat is clearly detected on an ultrasound. That is why they donate 10% of every sale to support pregnancy care centers across the country. They have raised over $800,000 for these centers and have saved thousands of lives. Now, let me tell you about the coffee because I am very picky about what I put into my body. It's mold-free, pesticide-free, shade-grown, and low-acid, and it's organically farmed. It truly checks all the boxes. So go to 7weekscoffee.com and save 15% forever when you subscribe. Plus, exclusively for my listeners, use the code OFFICIALCCW for an extra 10% off your first order. That's a 25% total savings on your first order. Remember, your order will directly help support a network of over 1,000 pro-life organizations across the U.S. So what in the world does it mean to petition the government? This is the section that we're getting into now. And before we dig into this, it goes a lot deeper than you realize. The idea of petitioning the government goes back hundreds and hundreds of years. Do you remember learning about the Magna Carta in school? I'm sure the name sounds very familiar to you if you didn't, or if you did, I'm sure you've heard of it in some shape or form. But this document was created in 1215, and it was signed by King John of England. Due to the rising taxes in England, the people became very angry as they could not afford to pay them. The threat of rebellion was real, and King John decided to sign the Magna Carta with the advice of his barons and advisors. The idea of petitioning the government comes in right here. This basically gave the barons a right to petition the king. And so that's kind of where the idea of petitioning the government comes from. The Magna Carta stated that not only people were subject to the law, but also the king as well. It was a way to essentially hold the king accountable. The Magna Carta had influenced how many nations were formed years later. Our founding fathers took lots of ideas from the Magna Carta when writing the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. Here is a small section from the beginning of the Magna Carta, and I just want y'all to listen to see if you can see any similarities between our founding documents and then the Magna Carta. First, that we have granted to God, and by this present charter have confirmed for us and our heirs in perpetuity, that the English Church shall be free, and shall have its rights undiminished, and its liberties unimpaired. While it is not exactly the same as our rights, we can conclude that the founders drew inspiration from the Magna Carta. I highly encourage you to go and read this in your own free time, because it is really neat to see the similarities between our founding documents and the Magna Carta, which was written hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years before our founders wrote the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. You remember when the colonists were under the British rule and they were oppressed? They had written a petition of redress and grievances, petitioning for King George III to essentially give them a break of all the taxes, as they had no one in Parliament to represent them and speak for them. However, King George III ignored every single one of their concerns. So that is why when declaring their freedom with the Declaration of Independence, they were justified in doing so, because they had petitioned the King George III over and over and over again, and they were just continuously ignored. This justified the American Revolution. James Madison was the writer of the Bill of Rights, and he just wanted to ensure Americans' rights to petition the government officials was protected. And he also wanted to ensure that our rights to protest were protected. He wanted to make sure the people have a chance to have their voices be heard by those who could actually do something about the issue. So with all that said, we are now at the final part of the First Amendment, and how can we as Americans petition the government? Not only could voters petition the government, but so could women, slaves, and immigrants. This was around the time of the American Revolution, after it was fought. Remember, women could not vote in the early days of America, and neither could slaves. Many slaves wrote to the government leaders petitioning for their freedom. Today, we still allow citizens to petition the government officials. This helps our voters become more informed, but also lets our government officials know what in the world is going on. When you are asked to sign a petition for something, you are essentially just signing your name, and the more popular a document is, the higher chance it has of our government officials seeing it. For example, on change.org, the top petition to sign right now is to mandate the availability of EpiPens in all public buildings. So that's just one example of a popular petition right now to sign. Do you remember the situation that happened with George Floyd? We talked about it a little bit earlier, but Justice for George Floyd was one of the top petitions signed in 2021. This was another petition that got many, many, many signatures. Back in 2024, I signed a petition when Laken Riley was murdered to install emergency buttons in places on campus. This story really just hit too close to home for me. My husband and I actually used to go to Lake Herrick every other evening to enjoy the fresh air, fishing, or exercising. We would take our dog Peaches and just let her walk around and play. But UGA is where my husband got his education, and Laken's murder happened right on the trails where we walked in the evenings. This story hit way too close to home for me, and it broke my heart because so many people were affected. A lot of my friends knew her. A lot of my coworkers were friends with her. And so it was just really, really hard for me to see that because I knew they were hurting. I knew that this young, innocent girl had been harmed and her life was taken in a very brutal way. And so I wanted to sign this petition because I felt it would be beneficial to have these emergency buttons in places on campus. Now, when you go to Lake Herrick at UGA or in Athens, you can see that there are emergency buttons everywhere. And it's important to understand that while having those emergency buttons may not have saved her life, but it could have gotten the police there quicker. It could have helped them find the suspect quicker. And who knows, it could have saved her life if she was able to get to it and push the button. I want to say that these emergency buttons also have cameras on them as well. So that's kind of important to note as well. I felt the need to sign this petition, and now these emergency buttons are all over campus. Why? Because enough people spoke up, signed it, and the government officials noticed and took action. This is how we enact change in our local communities. This is how we get those who are in office to help enact change and hear our side. Remember, before the American Revolution, the colonists had no one to petition for them in Parliament. So when forming and framing America, they were wanting to ensure that Americans had this right. We can thank our founding fathers for thinking through every little detail necessary to ensure our rights as Americans are protected. We can peaceably assemble and make petitions to the government. We can protest and march for things that truly matter to us. This is huge. This is also why it's so important that we make sure our rights are not infringed upon. For example, like the peaceful pro-life activists, their First Amendment rights were taken from them. And they were 100% violated because they were arrested and their case was not justly tried, in my opinion. Thankfully, we have a president now who's willing to stand up for our rights. If there is something you are passionate about, you can easily create a petition on change.org. And there are other websites that allow you to create petitions and let you sign them. But you typically have to have so many signatures before a government official will notice or is made aware. It never hurts to try. These petitions have pushed government officials to take stands or do things that they may not have otherwise done. While not everything needs a petition, if there is a cause you feel that needs one, make one. Just like the petition to place the emergency buttons on the UGA campus, while it may not make a huge difference, it will help. It cannot hurt to have them, and the campus wouldn't have probably put them there if people from all over had not signed the petition and pushed for it. While these 4 episodes conclude the First Amendment, next week's episode will be interesting as we will be diving into the Second Amendment. A lot of people are familiar with the Second Amendment, and I'm so excited to be discussing this with you all. If you guys are loving Voices of Liberty, please just share it with one friend. I highly suggest you share it with just one friend. It really just helps get the word out, expand our CCW community, our Voices of Liberty community, but also helps educate people on different topics of today, the political issues, and our founding documents. I think it's essential that we are all educated on this. And so if you know someone who really likes politics or is very big on learning things like this, I highly suggest you send Voices of Liberty podcast to them. It would really mean a lot to me. If you do, send me a screenshot at voicesoflibertycontact@gmail.com. I'll give you a shout out on the podcast, and I will also send you an exclusive CCW sticker while supplies last.